I always thought loyalty meant something. 32 years of perfect client retention. No defections, no quiet exits, no ugly breakups. Just steady trust, built contract by contract, handshake by handshake. But in a single meeting, with one smug smile and a sentence that dripped like battery acid, it was all declared worthless. "Your old school methods are toxic," she said. Not ineffective, not outdated, toxic. Like I was a poison that needed purging. Her voice had that brittle confidence only youth carries, the kind that doesn't know how fragile it really is. My name is Richard Hale. I'm 58 years old, and until that morning, I was senior partner of client relations at Ashburn and Myers Consulting Group. For 3 decades, I was the quiet spine of the company, the one who kept the billion-dollar clients from wandering into the arms of hungrier competitors. I wasn't flashy, and I wasn't loud. I was dependable, which in this industry is rarer than gold. Executives came and went. Strategy shifted every fiscal quarter, but my clients stayed. They stayed because I understood them better than they understood themselves. And then one Gen Z manager, with a title she hadn't earned, looked me dead in the eye and told me the future didn't have room for me. Her name was Carissa. 28 years old, with sharp bangs and sharper edges. She'd been promoted less for her record and more for her vocabulary. The kind of language that dazzles boardrooms, with phrases like cultural synergy and paradigm inclusivity. She leaned across the polished oak table, folded her manicured hands, and smiled, that tight smile of the conqueror. "Richard, it's time for a new era here. We need voices that reflect the future, not relics from the past." Relic. That was the word she chose. I felt the weight of it drop like a stone in my chest, but I didn't flinch. The announcement came a week later. My replacement wasn't a seasoned partner, wasn't someone with scars and stories and earned instincts. It was a new hire, straight from a diversity panel the company had recently paraded in the press. A young analyst elevated overnight into my chair. I don't begrudge anyone their shot, but this wasn't about talent. It was about optics. They paraded her around as proof of progress, and progress walked into the room and called our largest client problematic during her first meeting. That client had been with us 20 years. They'd weathered recessions, scandals, leadership turnovers, all with me as their constant point of contact. They trusted me because I respected them, because I knew when to push and when to yield, when to let them vent, and when to remind them of the bigger picture. All that vanished in one careless insult. Problematic. A word that sounds clinical, but really means contempt. Within weeks, they withdrew their contracts. $2 million gone in 30 days. And Carissa, my brilliant young manager, spun it as necessary disruption. I should have shouted. I should have slammed my fist on the table, rattled the glass water pitchers, demanded an ounce of respect for 3 decades of quiet victories. But I didn't. I smiled. I nodded. I let them write me out of the story like I was nothing more than a footnote. That's what unnerved them most. Silence. They expected rage, bitterness, maybe even begging. Instead, I packed my office slowly, methodically, slipping framed photos into boxes, sliding books from shelves, locking away the fountain pen a retiring client once pressed into my hand after signing his final deal. Because here's what they never understood. My power was never in my title. It wasn't in the desk or the corner office or the bullet points on a resume. My power was in the invisible threads I'd woven for 32 years. The dinners where a client revealed his fear of losing his father's company. The midnight phone calls when a merger teetered on collapse. The handwritten notes after funerals, weddings, and hospital stays. They thought those things vanished when they deleted my name from the directory. They didn't. They lived in me, in my memory, in the Rolodex I never digitized, the one no algorithm could scrape. So I shook her hand. Carissa, the new empress of empty words. Her grip was firm, but her eyes flickered when she met my smile. She thought it was compliance. It wasn't. It was a smile with teeth. I left the building quietly, the click of my shoes on marble echoing behind me. No grand speech, no exit interview fireworks, just silence, deliberate silence. Because silence, I've learned, is the rope you give the arrogant, and arrogance always pulls hard enough to hang itself. They thought I'd vanish. That once I walked out of that glass tower with my boxes stacked in the back seat of my car, I'd fade into retirement and shuffle off quietly, like an old dog. What they didn't understand was that I had never lived in that office to begin with. My real work, the work that mattered, was never about reports or quarterly reviews. It was in the shadows, in the quiet corners of restaurants, in the late-night phone calls that never made the minutes of any meeting. My desk was just a formality. My empire was built elsewhere. For 32 years I wasn't a salesman, though that was the label they pinned on me. I was an interpreter, a confidant, a strategist. Clients didn't come to me because of flashy proposals or PowerPoints. They came because when they sat across from me, I listened. Not the performative kind of listening you get in workshops. Real listening. The kind where you pick up on what a man doesn't say, what a woman won't admit, the pauses heavy enough to reveal the truth. I learned early that people sign contracts not with pens, but with trust. That was my weapon. That was my edge. And now, stripped of title and office, I still carried it. So I started making calls. Not loud ones. Not the kind that echo with bitterness or reek of revenge. Quiet calls. A lunch invitation here, a coffee there. Old clients who'd stayed because I steadied their hands in moments when they doubted themselves. Industry veterans who remembered my name because I returned theirs with respect, not condescension. I didn't ask for gossip. I didn't fish for dirt. I just asked questions, the kind that sound harmless until you realize how much weight they carry. How's the new team treating you? Are you getting the attention you need? Do you feel confident about the direction they're taking? The answers came like slow leaks in a dam. At first polite, measured, cautious. Then a crack, a shift in tone, a sigh they couldn't quite contain. And soon the water spilled. The new hire, my replacement, wasn't stumbling out of inexperience. She was walking with the swagger of someone who thought vocabulary alone could replace competence. Buzzwords polished like jewels, presented at meetings as if they were strategy. Decolonize client interaction. Reframe capitalist hierarchies. I almost laughed when I heard it. Almost. Except it wasn't funny when I heard how a decades-long partner, a client who had kept our company afloat during lean years, was dismissed as exploitative. The arrogance wasn't accidental. It was her armor, her shield against the reality that she didn't understand the business at all. And Carissa, my former manager, ate it up. She mistook jargon for genius. Every lost contract was spun as a moral victory. Every cutback, every termination, every withdrawal of funds was reframed as strategic pruning. She stood behind her hire like a general defending a burning fortress, blind to the fact that the flames weren't cleansing. It was collapse. The hemorrhage was real. Millions gone. Relationships shattered. But in their bubble, it was proof of progress. I didn't storm back in. I didn't send damning emails or throw gasoline on the fire. That's what they expected, that I'd lash out, exposing myself as the bitter relic they painted me to be. Instead, I let them keep digging. Every time a client cut ties, I made a note. Every time a colleague whispered frustration into their coffee cup, I wrote it down. Every arrogant phrase, every reckless presentation, every insult delivered with a smile, it all went into the file. Not on a company server, not in some fragile spreadsheet. In my hands, in my control. Each piece of evidence a round, chambered, polished, ready. I moved like a ghost through my old world. I was seen, but never noticed. Present, but never remarked upon. A dinner at an old haunt, where the maître d' still greeted me by name. A chance run-in at a golf course where the CEO of a lost client muttered under his breath about children running the shop. A handshake at a charity gala, where the smile was wide, but the whispered words were sharp. Richard, it's a disaster. I collected these moments quietly, methodically. My revenge wasn't rage. It was patience, sharpened into steel. Some nights I sat at my kitchen table, the stack of notes beside me, the evidence growing like a shadow. I'd pour a glass of whiskey, let it catch the light, and sit with it, untouched. The temptation was always there, to act, to strike, to expose. But I knew better. Timing was everything. Strike too soon, and it looks like spite. Strike too late, and you lose the moment. The art was in the wait, in letting them reveal themselves for what they truly were. One night, the file spread before me like a deck of cards. I whispered into the quiet air. Not yet. And the words tasted like iron on my tongue, because when the time came, it wouldn't be a whisper. It would be a thunderclap. 6 months passed, and what had been inevitable finally came to the surface. The same woman who had dismissed me as outdated, the same manager who told me my methods were toxic, now presided over a department rotting from the inside out. The veneer of progress and innovation had begun to crack, and beneath it was chaos. I watched from the periphery, silent, patient, never drawing attention to myself, while the empire I'd helped build for decades began to sag under the weight of arrogance. The moment that pushed one of our last loyal clients out the door happened on a Thursday. I knew about it before the sun went down, because word traveled quickly in my circles, faster than any press release or official memo. At a quarterly check-in, the new hire, the shining example of Carissa's vision, looked across the table at a client who had invested millions year after year and called them exploitative. She said it with a calm, clinical tone, like she was delivering a diagnosis, as though she were the one holding the power. The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. That client had endured recessions, regulatory audits, and leadership shakeups, but no one had ever dared insult them to their face under the banner of representation. By the next morning, their lawyers sent a termination notice. Another contract dissolved, another artery cut. It didn't stop there. Inside the walls of Ashburn and Myers, morale collapsed. The younger staff, the ones Carissa had promised would thrive in this new culture, found themselves under siege. Every mistake was magnified, every missed deadline punished. Behind closed doors, Carissa's voice could be heard through the glass, shouting, cursing, pointing fingers at anyone too junior to defend themselves. She blamed the market. She blamed the old guard mentality, still lingering in the company DNA. And, most of all, she blamed the clients themselves for not being evolved enough to understand the brilliance of her strategy. What she didn't see was the fear in the eyes of her team. What she didn't hear were the whispered complaints in elevators, the secret resumes being polished late at night, the steady trickle of talent slipping quietly out the door. She didn't see the company dying beneath her, and she wouldn't have cared if she had. Arrogance doesn't listen. It only performs. From my vantage point, it was all becoming clear. I dug deeper, not because I needed more proof, but because I wanted to sharpen every blade before I swung. What I found was uglier than I expected. Expense reports padded with personal indulgences, luxury hotels during client summits, private car services for weekends out, and business dinners that looked suspiciously like romantic getaways. I uncovered internal emails, forwarded quietly by allies who still trusted me, where clients were mocked outright, called backward, ignorant, even racist, for daring to push back against poorly conceived initiatives. There were presentations that bordered on malpractice, where figures were manipulated, charts inverted, and conclusions drawn from nothing but hot air and buzzwords. It wasn't just incompetence. It was willful fraud, wrapped in the language of virtue. I built the dossier piece by piece. Not to release it yet. Timing was everything. But to make sure when the strike came, there would be no recovery. Every document, every email, every recorded presentation was cataloged, copied, secured. It wasn't paranoia, it was procedure. You don't gut your opponent with a single stroke. You cut them 1,000 times and let them bleed until they collapse under their own weakness. At the same time, I expanded my reach. I didn't push my story. I didn't beg for sympathy or parade my grievances. I simply listened. At lunches with former clients, I let them vent their frustrations. With regulators, I asked about industry trends and compliance issues. In quiet conversations with board members, I nodded as they voiced concerns they didn't dare raise in meetings. They spoke more freely than they realized, and every word was another thread in the net I was weaving. I wasn't trying to convince anyone of anything. I was letting them convince themselves. The thing about arrogance is that it always rises before it falls. Carissa and her hire weren't hiding. They were parading. Even as the company hemorrhaged, even as contracts dissolved and morale eroded, they found ways to dress themselves in accolades. One evening, I stood on the sidewalk across from the office tower I once called home. The building glowed with artificial light, each pane of glass reflecting the city like a fractured mirror. On the top floor, in the very conference room where I had once celebrated decades of loyalty, they posed with a plaque from some industry group eager to showcase diverse leadership. They were smiling, holding the award as if it were a shield against the ruin creeping beneath their feet. I watched them laugh, their silhouettes framed in glass, oblivious to the decay surrounding them. The team they berated was already planning their exits. The clients they insulted were already gone. The empire they claimed to be reinventing was already crumbling. But they couldn't see it. They wouldn't see it. I stood there in the dark, the city buzzing around me, and whispered under my breath, quiet enough that only I could hear. The higher they climb. I let the words hang there, unfinished, because the ending didn't need to be spoken. It was already written. I learned a long time ago that the difference between vengeance and justice is timing. Strike too soon, and you look like a bitter man settling scores. Strike too late, and the damage hardens into permanence, impossible to undo. But strike at the right moment, when arrogance has swollen to its peak, when the guilty stand high on the stage they built for themselves, and the fall is absolute. That's why I waited. That's why every note I scribbled, every email I archived, every whispered complaint I tucked away was not just evidence, but ammunition. The fuse wasn't lit yet, but the line was primed, coiled, ready to catch. The dossier had grown thick. Inside it was the anatomy of a collapse, laid bare in black and white. expense reports stuffed with indulgences, spa retreats billed as client wellness sessions, designer handbags marked down as training materials, emails filled with scorn for the very clients who had once trusted Ashburn and Myers with their fortunes, mockery dressed up as moral superiority, slurs against companies that dared to resist their empty jargon. I had slideshows copied from quarterly decks where numbers were bent, forecasts exaggerated, and risk factors erased. Every piece cataloged, cross-referenced, timed like rounds in a magazine. Not one failure, not one insult, not one betrayal left unmarked. I wasn't motivated by anger anymore. That fire had cooled into something sharper. I moved like a sniper, unseen, my crosshairs fixed not on flesh, but on reputations. Precision was everything. My goal was not just to expose them, but to do so in a way that no one could look away. Not the board, not the regulators, not the clients, not even the press. Everyone would see it all at the same time. No cover story, no spin. Just the raw truth delivered in unison like a detonation. They had no idea. Inside their offices, they still paraded around like they were untouchable. Carissa, with her brittle confidence, spoke at luncheons about modernizing outdated practices, as if those outdated practices hadn't kept billion-dollar clients loyal for decades. The hire she shielded, the woman who alienated clients faster than she could collect paychecks, smiled on stage at conferences, congratulating herself for shaping the future of ethical consulting, while contracts bled away in silence. They were so far gone, they mistook the sound of crumbling walls for applause. And yet, arrogance is predictable. It follows a pattern, a rhythm, like a drumbeat you can time your steps to. Their next big move was the quarterly presentation, a carefully choreographed spectacle they believed would silence doubts. They would stand before the board, wave their buzzwords like banners, present graphs that bent reality into whatever shape they needed, and pretend the hemorrhage of millions was nothing more than an intentional pivot. I knew the script because I had written its earlier drafts for decades. The difference was that mine had always been tethered to truth. Theirs was air and shadows. I waited. I kept my profile low, my movements invisible. But behind the scenes, I pulled threads. I confirmed with allies on the board that they would be present, every one of them. I made sure regulators received copies of documents at the exact hour the presentation would begin. I arranged quiet meetings with journalists who had been sniffing around for a story, but lacked the proof. I didn't give them everything, not yet, only enough to sharpen their hunger. The rest would come all at once, timed so the strike couldn't be smothered. On the surface, I was nothing. An aging man, seen in passing at restaurants, shaking hands at fundraisers, nodding politely at industry dinners. Beneath the surface, I was tightening the noose. Every careless word they had spoken, every reckless insult they had hurled, every dollar they had siphoned into their vanity, I had it. They believed silence meant irrelevance. They were wrong. Silence meant preparation. The night before the quarterly meeting, I spread the dossier across my desk, like a general inspecting his maps. Each page was a battlefield, each exhibit a weapon. I read it slowly, methodically, letting the weight of it sink in. Not because I doubted, but because I wanted to feel the gravity of what was about to happen. This wasn't a tantrum. This wasn't a grudge. This was justice, carved sharp enough to leave scars. Morning came with clear skies, the kind of brightness that makes glass towers gleam as if they are invincible. I walked through the lobby of Ashburn and Myers, past the same marble floors I had crossed 1,000 times, past the receptionist who lowered her eyes when she saw me, perhaps guessing more than she should. My steps echoed, steady, deliberate. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't excited. My heart beat calm, cold. The boardroom doors stood at the end of the corridor, tall, polished, waiting. Behind them sat the liars, the pretenders, rehearsing the performance they thought would save them. They didn't know the stage was already wired. They didn't know the fuse was already lit. I reached up, straightened my tie, and let the quiet settle around me like an old coat. "Now," I whispered. The room was heavy with the scent of polished wood and stale ambition. Sunlight poured through the glass walls of the boardroom, gleaming off silver nameplates and water pitchers, as if the day itself had been staged for theater. Carissa sat at the head of the table, lips curved into that familiar thin smile of hers, and beside her the DEI hire shuffled her papers, radiating the false composure of someone who believed language could disguise weakness. Around them, directors shifted in leather chairs, adjusting ties, murmuring in low tones. They were restless, but not yet awake to the storm about to break over them. I sat 3 seats down, quiet, unremarkable, the dossier resting in a slim black case at my side. Months of preparation, every insult, every falsehood, every wasted dollar tucked inside, waiting. The presentation began on cue. Carissa rose, her heels clicking against the polished floor like a metronome. She talked of progress, of modernization, of shaking off outdated legacies. The DEI hire followed with slides so bright they nearly blinded, graphs bent into shapes that turned decline into strategic contraction, and losses into future-focused pruning. Her voice carried conviction, but not truth. I watched the board nod, half convinced, half bewildered. Lies always sound convincing when you want to believe them. When she declared that the company was positioned stronger than ever before, I opened the case. One click of the clasp, one shift of the hinge, and the weight of the dossier lay on the table. Heads turned. The chairman raised an eyebrow. Carissa faltered mid-sentence, her eyes flicking toward me with irritation, then confusion, then the first flicker of unease. I slid the first folder across the table, deliberately slow. "Before we move on," I said, my voice calm, even, "there are materials that need to be reviewed." The chairman opened it, and silence rippled outward like shockwaves. The first pages were expense reports, lined with designer purchases, luxury getaways, indulgences tucked beneath euphemisms. Then came the emails. Clients mocked as backward, partnerships dismissed as morally compromised, names dragged through disdain, while millions hung in the balance. Finally, the altered forecasts, charts manipulated beyond recognition, projections cut and pasted until fiction became policy. Each page was time-stamped, cross-referenced, undeniable. Carissa's voice tried to rise, but each attempt withered under the weight of her own handwriting, her own signatures, her own recorded quotes displayed across the table for all to see. And then the projector clicked. The journalists I had tipped off were already outside, receiving simultaneous copies. Regulators' inboxes lit up. Phones buzzed around the table as news alerts began to ping. There was no chance to contain it, no time to spin. The truth wasn't leaking, it was detonating. Carissa's face paled as the DEI hire shrank into her chair. The smug confidence drained from her as her own words appeared on the screen in stark black letters. "This client is exploitative. We don't need their money." The board shifted uncomfortably. I could see in their eyes the calculation, the scramble to distance themselves, to survive the wreckage. The chairman closed the folder, his expression carved from stone. He didn't look at me, not directly. He didn't have to. 2 security officers entered quietly from the back. Carissa opened her mouth to protest, to defend, but her voice cracked. The DEI hire tried to gather her papers, as if hiding them could erase what had just been exposed. Both were escorted out under HR's watch, the silence of the room louder than any verdict. No applause, no dignity, just the sound of footsteps fading into the hallway. Careers erased, not with drama, but with precision. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I stood, buttoned my jacket, and extended a hand to the chairman. He took it firmly, without a word, his eyes steady, but colder than they had ever been. That was enough. I picked up the empty case and walked out, leaving behind the ruins of what they had built on arrogance. Outside, the city air hit me sharp and clean. The hum of traffic, the chatter of strangers, the ordinary rhythm of life felt almost foreign after months of silence and preparation. I leaned against the stone railing, breathing it in, not with triumph, but with clarity. Because this was never just about them. This was about something older, something woven into the fabric of every age. Betrayal is older than any office. Revenge is older than any boardroom. Long before glass towers and quarterly reports, there were camps and tribes, kings and councils, all of them undone by the same patterns. Cain and Abel, Rome's Senate, knives flashing in the shadow of ambition, jungle predators circling, waiting for weakness. What happened in that boardroom was not new. It was just my verse in an endless song. I pushed away from the railing and began walking, the city stretching ahead in all its noise and light. Somewhere, someone else was being betrayed at that very moment. Somewhere, someone else was being dismissed, mocked, discarded, and somewhere, someone else would be waiting, patient, silent, sharpening their knife. Because arrogance always climbs higher than it should, and silence always waits, steady and still, until it's time to strike.